In a dim room in Grosse Pointe Park, Michigan, a telephone rang on the afternoon of July 30th, 1975. The man who picked it up would later become the boss of the mob for longer than anyone else in American history. He was a hidden ruler who ran the criminal world for 35 years, while most of the world never even knew his name. On the other end of that line, according to what people later said in court, Jimmy Hoffa's voice sounded confused. Nobody came, he said, talking about the get-together he had been promised at the Moshu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township. The strong leader of the Teamsters Union had been waiting in the hot weather for men who never planned to show up, at least not while he was still alive. Within hours, Hoffa would disappear from the earth. His vanishing would become one of the biggest puzzles in American crime history, causing countless searches, digs, and ideas that people still talk about today. And the man who most likely planned the whole thing, he would pass away peacefully in his own bed 39 years later, having spent only 11 months in jail during his whole life of crime. This is the tale of Giacomo Blackjack Tocco, the fancy gangster who showed that in the world of organized crime, the softest voice is often the strongest. Hey everyone. Before we go deep into one of the most interesting unknown stories in American Mafia history, I want to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Type your spot in the comments. Are you hearing this in bed at 2 o'clock a.m. on your trip to work? Tell me, and if you're prepared for a lesson in how a real gangster worked, hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button if you enjoy true crime, and pass this on to anybody who finds the real stories behind organized crime interesting. Now let's step into the world of Blackjack Tocco. October 1926, Grosse Pointe Park, Michigan. When Giacomo William Tocco came into the world in the fancy Detroit suburb of Grosse Pointe Park, he wasn't just born into money and good fortune. He was born into American Mafia nobility. His dad, William Black Bill Tocco, was no normal business person, and his mom, Rosalie Zerilli, came from a family line that would shape organized crime in the Motor City for the next 100 years. To get Jack Tocco's life, you have to first get the world that made him. Detroit in the 1920s was a city that had changed. The car business had turned it into a strong industrial center, pulling workers from all over the world. Cash moved through the city like the Detroit River that ran next to it. And where cash moves, organized crime follows. Black Bill Tocco had come to America from Sicily in the early 1900s, carrying with him the old country ways of La Cosa Nostra, our thing, as members called the Mafia. He settled in Detroit's expanding Italian community, where Sicilian immigrants stuck together, keeping their language, habits, and yes, their illegal activities. But it was the Volstead Act of 1919, Prohibition, that really made Detroit's fortune. The city's location was perfect for sneaking alcohol across the Detroit River, Windsor, Ontario, where alcohol stayed legal. On any given night during Prohibition, boats filled with Canadian whiskey would cross the slim stretch of water, giving their goods to eager distributors on the American side. In winter, when the river froze solid, smugglers would drive trucks across the ice. Detroit became the main entry spot for an estimated 75% of all illegal alcohol coming into the United States during Prohibition. The money was huge, and the men who controlled this flow became rich beyond imagination. Black Bill Tocco was one of those men, but more importantly, he was a forward thinker who got that the real power came not from sneaking alcohol itself, but from organizing it, controlling it, and getting rid of competition. The 1920s in Detroit were marked by extreme fighting as different gangs battled for control of the profitable bootlegging trade. The crosstown mob wars, as they came to be called, turned the city's streets into a war zone. Sicilian gangs fought each other, fought the Jewish Purple Gang, and fought the Irish mobsters, who also wanted a piece of the action. Bodies piled up, the violence hit everyone, and was bad for business. Something had to give. By the early 1930s, as Prohibition was ending and young Jack Tocco was starting elementary school, his father was part of what was maybe the most important event in Detroit organized crime history, the creation of what would become known as the Detroit Partnership. In 1931, Black Bill Tocco and his partners, including Joseph Joe Anno Zerilli, who had become Jack's uncle by marriage, set up a peace among the fighting Sicilian groups. They built a structured organization modeled after the Mafia families in New York, with a clear chain of command, rules for how to act, and most importantly, a method for splitting up territory and profits that would stop future bloodshed. The Detroit Partnership was born, unlike other crime families that were named after their leaders. Detroit's group was called a partnership, a word that showed the teamwork spirit of how it started. Several powerful men had come together, put aside their differences, and agreed to work together for shared profit. Joe Zerilli came out as the clear boss, with Black Bill Tocco as his most trusted ally and underboss. Together, they built an empire that would last for decades. This was the world Jack Tocco grew up in. His dad wasn't just a successful business person. He was one of the founding fathers of a criminal dynasty. His uncle Joe Zerilli wasn't just a respected community member. He was the boss of bosses, feared and respected throughout the underworld. The Tocco family lived in the Windmill Point section of Grosse Pointe Park, an exclusive area of impressive homes, streets with trees, and old money. Their neighbors were car company executives, successful doctors, well-known lawyers, and politicians. On the outside, nothing set the Tocco home apart from any other rich family in the area. Young Jack went to good schools, played sports, went to church every Sunday with his mom, and joined in all the activities expected of an upper-middle-class kid. His dad insisted on it. Black Bill Tocco understood something that many of his criminal peers did not. Being seen as lawful was power. The Tocco kids were taught to be polite, to talk properly, to value learning, and to never ever talk about their father's work in public. Black Bill was a successful entrepreneur with stakes in various lawful businesses. The truth of his underworld activities was kept to quiet talks in back rooms, late-night phone calls, and meetings with men who came after dark and left before dawn. Jack soaked all of this in. He watched his father work with intelligence and good judgment. He saw how his Uncle Joe commanded respect without raising his voice, how problems were fixed with quiet talks rather than gunfire, how real power meant never having to prove you had it. These teachings would help him greatly. The year was 1949, and Jack Tocco stood among his graduating class at the University of Detroit, a respected Jesuit school. He held a degree in finance, a real degree, not some honorary thing given by a scared institution. He had gone to classes, done assignments, taken exams, and earned his credentials honestly. This was very unusual for someone in his spot. In the 1940s, the vast majority of Mafia members had little formal schooling. Many were immigrants or children of immigrants who had started working young to help support their families. Street smarts were valued more than book learning. The ability to handle yourself in a fight mattered more than understanding money or accounting. But Joe Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco were forward-thinking men. They understood that Prohibition had been unusual, a time when making money was fairly easy because the whole country wanted a product that was against the law. They knew that keeping a criminal business going over the long haul required business sense, money skills, and the ability to run lawful businesses that could clean dirty money and give cover for illegal activities. They pushed their sons and nephews to get schooled. Jack Tocco did great in school. He had a sharp mind for numbers and a natural understanding of finance and investment. His teachers remembered him as serious, hard-working, and ambitious. Just the kind of young man who would go far in the business world. They had no clue how right they were. When Jack graduated, his father and uncle gave him a present that would prove very valuable: joint ownership of a racetrack, Hazel Park Raceway. Located in the Detroit suburb of Hazel Park, was on the surface a lawful business. Horse racing was legal, popular, and profitable. Jack would share ownership with his cousin Anthony Tony Zerilli, Joe's son. The two young men, both in their early 20s, both college educated, both heirs to a criminal empire, now had a lawful business that made good money, gave work chances for partners, and most of all, offered countless chances for skimming, money cleaning, and other profitable activities. Hazel Park Raceway would stay under Tocco family control for over 40 years, making millions of dollars in both lawful and unlawful income. It became a cornerstone of the Detroit partnership's work and a symbol of Jack Tocco's business thinking. Look lawful, act lawful, and use lawful businesses as the base for criminal activity. Jack married young, as was usual in Italian families of that time. His wife Toni came from a respectable Italian-American family in the Detroit area. She was pretty, smart, devoted, and according to all accounts, truly unaware of the full scope of her husband's activities. Or maybe she knew and chose not to know. A common setup in mafia families. The couple settled in Grosse Pointe Park, not far from where Jack had grown up. They would eventually have 8 kids together, raising them in the same environment of outward respectability and inward secrecy that Jack had experienced in his own childhood. To their neighbors, Jack Tocco was a successful businessperson involved in real estate development, horse racing, and various other ventures. He was polite, well-spoken, generous with local charities, and devoted to his family. He went to Mass regularly at the local Catholic church. His kids went to good schools. He drove nice cars, but not flashy ones. He dressed well, but simply. He was in every visible way the picture of the American dream, the grandson of immigrants who had worked hard, gotten educated, and found success. The truth, of course, was very different. The 1950s and 1960s were the peak years of the Detroit partnership. The group had made it through prohibition and successfully moved to other rackets. Their operations were varied and highly profitable: gambling. The partnership controlled bookmaking operations throughout Detroit and nearby areas. They ran numbers rackets, sports betting, and had stakes in casinos in Nevada and Cuba before Castro's revolution. The gambling operations alone made millions of dollars yearly. Loan sharking, high-interest loans to people who couldn't get credit through lawful sources. The enforcement of these debts ranged from strong warnings to broken bones. Depending on the situation and the person who owed money, the interest rates were unfair, sometimes as high as 20% per week. But desperate people paid them. Labor union control? This was maybe the partnership's most valuable thing. Detroit was a union town. The car industry employed hundreds of thousands of workers, all of them union members. The Teamsters Union, which represented truck drivers and warehouse workers, was especially important. Control over unions meant control over strikes, over retirement funds, over hiring, and over the flow of goods throughout the area: drugs, While some old-school mafia members looked down on drug dealing, the Detroit partnership was heavily involved in heroin bringing in. They had strong ties to Sicilian suppliers and controlled much of the heroin distribution in the Midwest. The profits were huge, and the partnership's leaders were practical enough to ignore the traditional rule against drug dealing. Lawful businesses, real estate, construction companies, restaurants, vending machine companies, garbage hauling, produce distribution. The partnership had stakes in dozens of lawful businesses that both made income and gave money cleaning chances. Jack Tocco was involved in all of it. The exact date of his formal induction into La Cosa Nostra, his making ceremony, stays classified in FBI files. But by the mid-1950s, Jack Tocco was a made man, a full member of the Detroit partnership with all the rights, duties, and protections that came with that status. The making ceremony in traditional mafia families was a sacred ritual. The inductee would be brought to a secret spot where senior members had gathered. He would be told the rules: never betray the family, never disrespect another member's wife, always be available when asked, and above all, tipo merda, the code of silence. A gun and a knife would be placed on a table. The inductee would prick his finger, letting blood drip onto a holy card. Usually showing a saint, the card would be set on fire, and as it burned in his hands, he would swear his promise of loyalty, saying that he would burn like the saint if he ever betrayed the family. From that moment on, he was a made man, untouchable by anyone outside the family without okay from the bosses. Part of a brotherhood that went beyond blood, protected by a group with arms reaching across the country and back to Sicily. Jack Tocco took these promises seriously. Unlike many modern mobsters who would later treat their membership as just a criminal job, Tocco embraced the tradition and order of La Cosa Nostra. He understood that the real power of the mafia came not from violence or scaring people, though those tools were there when needed, but from the organizational setup, the web of relationships, and the rules for acting that let trust exist in a basically untrustworthy business. During these years, Jack earned his nickname, Blackjack. There are several ideas about where it came from. Some say it was just passed down from his dad, Black Bill, as was common with Italian nicknames. Others claim it referred to his dark hair and skin. Still, others suggest it was tied to his skill at blackjack and other gambling games. But those who knew him in the underworld offered a darker meaning. Jack Tocco was called Blackjack because when he had a job to do when something needed handling, he would do it without pause, without mercy, and without leaving witnesses, like the card game blackjack. He played for keeps, and he played to win. Jack Tocco was not mainly an enforcer or a hitman. His intelligence and business sense made him way too valuable for such routine work. The partnership had plenty of soldiers and partners who could handle physical violence. But when a situation called for someone with authority, someone who could make choices on the spot, someone who would make sure the job was done right, that's when Jack Tocco would be involved. He built a name for being methodical, careful, and effective. When Jack Tocco handled something, it stayed handled. Problems didn't come back. Loose ends didn't stay loose. But he also understood something that many in the life never grasp. Violence should be a last choice, not a first response. Violence drew attention. Violence created cycles of payback. Violence was costly and unpredictable. Better to fix problems with money, with reason, with talks. Better to win over your enemies than kill them. Better to be feared for what you might do than for what you had done. This thinking would shape his later leadership style. By the late 1960s, as Jack Tocco moved into his 40s, the Detroit partnership was at the peak of its power. FBI guesses suggested the group had about 100 made men, full members who had gone through the induction ceremony, plus several hundred partners who worked with the family without being formally inducted. This might not sound impressive compared to New York's 5 families, each of which had several hundred made men, but Detroit controlled a huge area. The partnership's reach spread throughout Michigan, into Ohio, especially Toledo, across the border into Windsor, Ontario, and most profitably into Las Vegas, where Detroit had stakes in several casinos. The Partinico group within the partnership deserves special mention. These were members either born in or descended from the small Sicilian town of Partinico near Palermo. They kept close ties to the Sicilian Mafia and controlled much of the heroin bringing in operation. The heroin would come from Sicily through various ports, be given out through Detroit, and then sent to other cities across the Midwest and beyond. This Sicilian connection was one of Detroit's biggest strengths. While other American families had to work through go-betweens to get drugs, Detroit had direct ties to the suppliers. This meant higher quality product, better prices, and more dependable supply chains. The partnership's control over Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Union was its crown jewel. Hoffa, who had grown up in Detroit, had risen to become president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1957. Under his lead, the Teamsters had become the biggest union in America, with over 17 million members and a retirement fund worth billions of dollars. The retirement fund was the key. The Teamster Central States Pension Fund gave loans for building projects, real estate developments, and casino operations, often without the close checking that regular banks would need. If you wanted to build a casino in Las Vegas in the 1960s but couldn't get normal financing, the Teamsters Pension Fund might give you a loan. And the Detroit partnership had major say over who got those loans. The connection between Hoffa and the partnership was complicated. Hoffa truly believed he was helping working people and building the union's power, but he also understood that he owed his spot partly to mob support, and he gave back by making sure that loans went to mob-connected projects and by giving partnership members control over various local Teamster offices. The money made was huge. Casino skim operations alone were worth millions yearly. When you owned or had stakes in a casino, you could mess with account rooms where money was added up before being reported to regulators. Millions of dollars would just vanish into suitcases, into the pockets of messengers, into secret accounts, never showing up on any tax form or financial statement. The Detroit partnership also held a rare honor: a seat on the Commission, the ruling body of La Cosa Nostra. The Commission had been set up in the 1930s by Lucky, Luciano, and other forward-thinking bosses as a way to settle fights between families and set rules for the national group. Usually, only the New York families had permanent seats, with other families having less formal representation. But Detroit's power and sway, especially its control over the Midwest and its Las Vegas interests, earned regular representation on the Commission. Joe Zerilli's voice carried weight in national mafia matters, which turned into extra respect and chances for the partnership. This was the empire that Jack Tocco was getting ready to inherit. Throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, Jack Tocco worked closely with Papa John Priziola, the partnership's longtime consigliere. The consigliere spot in a mafia family is special. Part advisor, part go-between, part experienced leader. The consigliere doesn't command soldiers or oversee operations. Instead, he gives advice to the boss, settles internal fights, and stands for the wisdom of experience. Papa John Priziola was old school in the best way. He had made it through the bootlegging wars, the post-prohibition shift, and decades of FBI watching. He understood how to work in the shadows, how to avoid notice, how to build shields between the leaders and the actual doing of crimes. Jack Tocco soaked up everything Papa John taught him. The lessons were small but priceless. Never put anything in writing, no letters, no contracts, no papers that could be subpoenaed or taken. Important talks happened face to face in spots checked for bugs with code words and hints that gave investigators nothing solid. Keep your lawful businesses truly successful. Don't just use them as covers. Actually run them profitably. This gives both income and believability when investigators come asking. Distance yourself from actual criminal activity. Use layers of go-betweens. Never personally pick up money. Never personally do violence. Never personally do anything that could be directly prosecuted. Build relationships throughout society, judges, politicians, police officers, business leaders, religious figures. All of them should see you as a rock of the community, not a criminal. Live simply compared to your actual wealth. Driving a Ferrari and wearing $1,000 suits draws notice. Driving a nice but average car and dressing like a successful professional lets you fit in. During this time, Jack Tocco was building his real estate empire. In 1970, he bought a 32-acre spread in Oakland Township for $112,000. This wasn't just a personal home. It was a smart investment. He split up part of the property and built Royal View Estates, a home subdivision that made millions in profit over the years. Royal Construction Company, which Jack controlled, handled building projects throughout the Detroit area. The company was truly successful, doing good work on time and building a solid name in the construction industry. This gave Jack legal income to report on tax returns, ties with other business leaders, and chances for money cleaning through padded bills and fake costs. At home, Jack and Tony were raising their 8 kids in what looked like a perfect family setting. The kids went to good schools, joined in sports and other activities, and were being raised to be successful in lawful careers. Jack was a devoted dad who went to his kids' events, helped with homework, and stressed the importance of education. The family went to church regularly. Jack gave generously to the parish and to Catholic charities. He sponsored youth sports teams. He gave to local political campaigns. He served on the boards of various community groups. To everyone who knew him, Jack Tocco was the picture of success. A first-generation American who had gotten a college education, built successful businesses, raised a big family, and given to his community. His Italian background was something to be proud of, not hidden. He showed the promise that America gave to immigrants willing to work hard and follow the rules. Except, of course, he wasn't following the rules. Under the respectable surface, Jack Tocco was moving up through the ranks of a criminal group responsible for murder, drug dealing, extortion, and huge money crimes. But very few people saw that side of him. He split his life into parts with amazing control. His kids had no clue what their father really did. His lawful business partners believed he was just a smart developer. His neighbors saw only the generous, community-minded family man. This ability to keep separate identities, to truly be both things at once, was maybe Jack Tocco's greatest skill. He wasn't pretending to be a lawful business person while secretly being a gangster. He actually was a lawful business person who was also a gangster. Both identities were real, true, and carefully built. The afternoon of July 30th, 1975, started normally enough at the Tocco household in Grosse Pointe Park. Jack was handling business calls, checking on building projects, maybe spending time with family. The weather was warm and nice, a typical summer day in suburban Detroit. Meanwhile, Across the metro area, events were happening that would become one of the biggest mysteries in American crime history. Jimmy Hoffa had been let out of federal prison in December 1971. After serving nearly 5 years for jury tampering and fraud, President Richard Nixon had shortened his sentence, though with a condition. Hoffa was banned from union activities until 1980. For a man whose whole identity was tied up in the Teamsters Union, this was unacceptable. Hoffa right away started fighting the ban, filing lawsuits and looking for support to get back to power by 1975. He was sure he could beat the ban and take back the Teamsters presidency. There was just one problem. The Detroit partnership didn't want him back. During Hoffa's time in prison, enforced break from union leadership, his replacement Frank Fitzsimmons had shown himself much easier for the mob to control. The Teamsters pension fund kept going to mob-connected projects, but without Hoffa's explosive personality and unpredictable behavior, Fitzsimmons was manageable. Hoffa never had been. More importantly, Hoffa knew too much. He knew about the pension fund schemes, about the casino financing, about the ties between union officials and organized crime figures. If federal prosecutors ever turned him, if he chose to trade information for a lighter sentence in any future cases, the damage to the Detroit partnership and other crime families would be terrible. Hoffa had become a risk that needed to be removed. The setup was neat in its simplicity. Hoffa got word that Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano wanted to meet with him to talk about a possible getting back together. Giacalone was a high-ranking Detroit partnership member. Provenzano was a Teamsters official with strong ties to the Genovese crime family in New Jersey. Hoffa and Provenzano had been feuding for years, going back to when they'd both been locked up at the same federal place. The offer of a peace meeting wasn't far-fetched. In the Mafia world, such sit-downs were common ways to fix fights. The meeting was set for 2:00 p.m. at the Mashu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a nice suburb northwest of Detroit. The spot was important. It was a lawful restaurant in a good area, the kind of place where business people met for lunch. Nothing suspicious about it. Hoffa got there early. Around 1:30 p.m., he was dressed casually in a dark blue short-sleeve shirt and blue pants. He made several phone calls from a payphone at the restaurant, checking in with partners and family members. In his last call to his wife, Josephine, around 2:30 p.m., he showed frustration. Nobody came. This call has haunted investigators and Hoffa's family ever since. Because someone did come, just not who Hoffa was waiting for. What happened next has been the subject of intense guesswork, investigation, and countless ideas, but based on FBI probes, informant stories, and logical thinking. The most likely picture is this. Hoffa was approached, probably by someone he knew and trusted, possibly Chucky O'Brien, his foster son, or another close partner. He was told the meeting place had changed, which wasn't unusual. He got into a car, thinking he was being driven to the new meeting spot. He likely never got to any meeting. Instead, he was driven to a picked-out spot, maybe a house, maybe a warehouse, where he was killed. The way he died was probably quick and brutal. A gunshot to the head or blunt force trauma. Some ideas suggest he was choked. One of the most lasting ideas involves Carlo Licata, a Detroit partnership soldier who was Jack Tocco's brother-in-law. According to some informants, Hoffa was taken to Licata's house where he was killed. Some accounts claim he was killed by blunt force trauma or a gunshot. The exact way stays unknown, but killing Hoffa was only half the problem. The body had to vanish completely. If Hoffa's body was found, even years later, It would set off a murder investigation with all the tools the federal government could pull together. Every bit of crime scene proof would be studied. Everyone with any tie to Hoffa would be investigated. The body couldn't just be buried somewhere. It had to be wrecked so completely that it could never be found. Many ideas have come up about the body's disposal, the central sanitation idea. One of the most believable ideas involves central sanitation, a waste disposal place in Hamtramck with known mob ties. Hoffa's body could have been put in a 55-gallon drum filled with concrete and buried in a dump. The place handled so much trash that finding a single drum decades later would be nearly impossible. The cremation idea. Several informants have claimed the body was burned. Maybe at a mob-connected funeral home. This would make sure all proof was destroyed, including any crime scene material that could point to the killers. The Tocco property idea? Tony Zerilli claimed Hoffa was buried on a big piece of land in northern Oakland County and controlled by a Tocco partner. According to Zerilli's story, the body was brought there and buried under what was then an open field. The FBI dug up the property in June 2013 with heavy machines and ground-penetrating radar. They found nothing. They ended up as seafood idea. One lasting Detroit street rumor claims Hoffa ended up as seafood in the Great Lakes, meaning his body was dumped in the Detroit River or one of the Great Lakes, maybe weighed down or cut into pieces to make sure it would never come up. The New Jersey dump idea. More recent investigations have focused on the chance that Hoffa's body was moved to New Jersey and buried in a dump near Giants Stadium. Now torn down, this idea has never been clearly proven or disproven. What part did Jack Tocco play in all this? According to FBI study and informant statements, Jack Tocco gave the final okay for Hoffa's murder. As a high-ranking member of the partnership and someone getting ready for eventual leadership, he would have been asked about such a big choice. The actual planning was likely handled by the Giacalone brothers, Tony Jack and Vito, Billy Jack Giacalone, along with other soldiers and partners, but Jack Tocco, even if not actually there at the murder itself, was part of the plot from the start. This wasn't a hasty choice or a crime of passion. It was a calculated business decision. Jimmy Hoffa had become a threat to the partnership's interests. And in the world of La Cosa Nostra, such threats are removed. The murder was done with amazing efficiency. Despite one of the biggest missing person investigations in American history, despite decades of FBI work, despite many witnesses and informants coming forward, despite modern crime-solving methods being used on every lead, nothing solid has ever been proven. No body was found. No murder weapon was recovered. No crime scene proof tied anyone to the crime. Every witness claimed ignorance or gave information that led nowhere. Jack Tocco, if he was involved, left no trail at all. And that level of planning, that ability to set up a complicated plot involving many people while making sure that no proof remained, that showed exactly why he was being readied for leadership. This was a man who could be trusted with the most delicate operations. This was a man who understood that in the modern age with FBI watching and RICO laws and aggressive prosecutors, the only safe crime was one that left no proof behind. On October 30th, 1977, Joseph Joe Anno Zerilli died of natural causes at the age of 86. He had led the Detroit partnership for over 40 years, surviving Prohibition, the post-war era, the heroin boom of the 1960s, and the starts of aggressive federal prosecution of organized crime. His funeral was a who's who of Detroit's Italian-American community. Lawful business people, politicians, labor leaders, and hundreds of regular citizens paid their respects to a man they knew as a generous giver and community leader. The FBI took pictures of those there spotting many as known organized crime figures. But that proved nothing in court. With Zerilli's death, the question of who would take over came up. The traditional choice would have been Papa John Priziola, the longtime consigliere. Priziola had the experience, the respect, and the wisdom to lead the group. At 76 years old, he stood for continuity with the partnership's starting generation. But Joe Zerilli, before his death, had made his wishes known. He wanted his nephew Jack Tocco to take his place. This choice made sense on many levels. Priziola was old and unlikely to lead for more than a few years. Jack Tocco was in his early 50s, young enough to lead for decades, but experienced enough to command respect. He was college educated and business savvy in an age when the Mafia needed to be more polished. He had shown himself loyal, capable, and careful. Most importantly, he was family. The partnership had always been about blood ties and marriage connections. Jack Tocco was both Zerilli's nephew and Black Bill Tocco's son, linking him to both starting families of the group. Priziola kindly accepted this choice. He would keep on as consigliere, giving advice to the new boss, while letting the younger generation lead. It was a classy move by a man who put the group's interests ahead of personal goals. But the formal handover would have to wait. Priziola died on May 3, 1979, at the age of 78. With his death, the last link to the partnership's starting generation was gone. The path was now clear for Jack Tocco to formally take leadership. On June 11, 1979, a ceremony was held at the Timberland Game Ranch in Dexter Township, Michigan, about 30 miles west of Detroit. This private place, surrounded by woods and far from nosy eyes, was a perfect spot for what was about to happen. The FBI knew something big was going on. Their watching had picked up preparations. More talking among known mob figures and unusual movements. They put agents with zoom lens cameras at key spots around the ranch. What they photographed that day was historic. The formal installation of Giacomo Blackjack Tocco as the new boss of the Detroit partnership. About 30 made members of the group were there, standing for the remaining strength of Detroit's Mafia family. The ceremony would have followed traditional steps. Promises of loyalty renewed, a new chain of command announced, and talks about the future of the group. Jack Tocco officially became the boss. As a sign of family togetherness and respect, he named his cousin Anthony Tony Zerilli as Underboss. Tony Z was Joe Zerilli's son, and giving him the number 2 spot made sure that both branches of the starting families were shown in leadership. The FBI photos from that day are amazing history documents. They show men in suits gathered outside. Some clearly knew they were being photographed, and others seemed unaware. Jack Tocco can be picked out in several shots, looking every bit the successful business person rather than a mafia boss. But becoming boss in 1979 was very different from becoming boss in 1931 or even 1950. The world had changed a lot, and not in ways good for La Cosa Nostra, the RICO Act. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act had been passed in 1970. This federal law let prosecutors charge the whole leadership of a criminal group for crimes done by those under them, as long as those crimes helped the group's interests. It was specifically made to break the Mafia's chain of command by making bosses responsible for crimes they ordered but didn't personally do. By 1979, RICO was starting to be used aggressively against organized crime families across the country. The FBI had hugely expanded its organized crime investigations. Wiretapping tech had gotten better. The Witness Protection Program let informants speak in court without fear of payback. And maybe most importantly, The older code of silence was starting to crack as more mobsters chose working with the law over long prison sentences. The Detroit partnership that Jack Tocco took over was a shadow of what it had been in the 1960s. Several key members were in prison or facing charges. Others had died of natural causes without good replacements being raised. The heroin trade, while still profitable, was increasingly risky as federal drug enforcement got stronger. The labor union influence stayed strong, but it was under more and more watching. The Teamsters were being investigated. The AFL-CIO was doing internal probes into mob influence. Government oversight was growing. The Las Vegas casino operations, once a cash cow, were being reformed. Nevada gaming regulators were becoming stricter about who owned casinos. Companies were buying out mob-connected casinos, replacing the old skim operations with lawful corporate accounting. Jack Tocco faced a basic question. How do you lead a mafia family in an age when the usual activities are getting harder and the penalties for getting caught are worse than ever? His answer would shape his leadership style and finally explain his amazing long run. Jack Tocco's way of leading was totally different from what was happening in other crime families during the 1980s. While John Gotti was making headlines in New York with his showy lifestyle and bold disregard for law enforcement, Tocco was doing exactly the opposite. No press meetings or perp walks with expensive suits. No social club headquarters where everyone knew to find the boss. No high-profile trials that turned mobsters into celebrities. Jack Tocco's plan was simple: be unseen. He ran the Detroit partnership like a lawful corporation, because in many ways it was. The organization chart was clear. Duties were handed out. Shields were kept between leadership and street-level crime. Talk was careful and coded, and above all, nothing happened without proper okay through the chain of command. The usual rackets kept going, but with much more care. Gambling operations stayed profitable, but were done with extreme caution. Bookmaking operations used complex communication systems to avoid wiretaps. Illegal gambling houses were moved often to avoid being found. And importantly, violence was strictly banned except in the most extreme cases. Nothing drew police attention like bodies. Loan sharking kept going, but with more polished money setups. Interest rates, while still high, were somewhat more fair than the old days. Ways to collect relied more on the threat of violence and actual violence. And importantly, loans were written down in codes so that profits could be tracked and shared rightly within the group. Labor union influence was maybe the most valuable thing left. While the days of fully controlling unions were ending, the partnership still kept ties with key union officials. These ties gave access to pension funds, say overstrikes and work stoppages, and chances for construction industry control. Jack Tocco, with his lawful construction company, was perfectly set to use these connections. Drug dealing became increasingly risky during the 1980s as the federal government started its war on drugs. The penalties for major drug crimes were severe. Life sentences weren't rare. The partnership pulled back some, though some members kept being involved despite the risks. But the real genius of Jack Tocco's leadership was his focus on lawful businesses. Hazel Park kept going as a profitable harness racing and simulcast place, making millions in legal money while still offering quiet cleaning chances through concessions. Parking and seller contracts, Royal Construction Company, and related real estate deals were hugely successful. Jack Tocco had a true talent for real estate development. He could spot underpriced properties, put together land pieces, get through zoning and permit processes, and build projects that were truly profitable. Royal View Estates, the subdivision he built from his Oakland Township property, made millions in lawful profits. Other developments followed. He built ties with banks, with other developers, with city officials, all of whom saw him as a lawful business person. The beauty of this approach was that it gave legal income, money that could be reported on tax returns, used to explain his lifestyle, and shown to investigators who questioned his wealth. Money cleaning chances. Building projects are cash-heavy and involve many subcontractors, making it fairly easy to pad costs, create fake expenses, or otherwise move money from illegal sources into lawful businesses. Sway and connections. Successful lawful businesses put you in touch with politicians, judges, police officials, and other powerful people. Relationships that are priceless when you need favors or information. Respectability. The more lawful your public image, the harder it is for prosecutors to convince juries you're a dangerous criminal. Jack Tocco, successful developer in Community Rock, didn't fit the picture of a mafia boss, fallback spot. If the illegal operations became too risky, or if prosecutions seemed close, the lawful businesses could keep making income. Tocco was truly wealthy, even apart from his criminal activities. During the 1980s, Jack Tocco also put into action what might be called an intermarriage policy. He encouraged members of the partnership to marry within the extended family network or to marry into other mob families. This made bonds stronger, ensured loyalty through family ties, and made it harder for anyone to work with law enforcement when doing so would bring in relatives. His own 8 kids were raised to value family loyalty above all else. While he apparently didn't raise them to go into the life, several went into lawful professional careers. He taught them the importance of family secrets and the code of omerta, even if they didn't fully get what they were protecting. Jack Tocco also kept the Detroit partnership's traditional way with violence. Use it rarely and never in public. The 1980s saw mob wars in other cities, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, as different groups battled for control. Bodies piled up, innocent bystanders were sometimes hit. The publicity was terrible, and law enforcement answered with huge investigations. Detroit had almost none of this. There were occasional murders, usually tied to drug deals gone wrong, or independent criminals who tried to work without permission. But internal partnership violence was almost non-existent. Fights were settled through the chain of command. Steps were followed, and everyone understood that not allowed violence would result in serious results. This control was key to the partnership's survival. While the FBI was putting huge resources into families in New York and Philadelphia, Detroit worked fairly quietly. The partnership was still investigated, still watched, but it wasn't the priority that the more visible families had become. Jack Tocco understood something basic in the modern age. The mafia's biggest enemy wasn't other crime families. It was the federal government, every headline, every body. Every public show of mob power gave prosecutors weapons and public backing for aggressive investigations. Stay quiet, stay hidden, and you might make it. Las Vegas in the 1980s was going through a change. The mob-connected casinos that had ruled the Strip for decades were being bought out by companies. Howard Hughes had started the process in the 1960s, and by the 1980s major companies like Hilton and Holiday Inn were getting into the casino business. But Detroit still kept stakes in several places in the skim operations. While less than their peak, kept making good money. The Detroit partnership's main Las Vegas link was the Aladdin Hotel and Casino. Through front men and complex ownership setups, Detroit had say over the place, while Tony Zerilli stayed the named underboss. The day-to-day Vegas coordination was handled by Capo Peter Vitale, and Underboss-in-waiting Vito Billy Jack Giacalone. And Tony Zerilli loved to talk. This was a key difference between Tony Z and his cousin Jack. While Tocco was naturally unable to brag or draw attention to himself, Tony Zerilli liked the status that came with his spot. He hung out with celebrities, threw parties, and sometimes let slip information about partnership operations. FBI informants and working with the law witnesses later said that Zerilli had bragged about Detroit's Las Vegas interests, about the millions being skimmed, about the various scams and schemes that made partnership members rich. He apparently saw these stories as harmless showing off among partners, not understanding that loose talk would eventually lead to prosecution. The Edgewater Casino in Laughlin, Nevada, was another Detroit interest, according to later stories. The partnership managed to skim about $10 million from this place over several years. The operation was polished. Money would be taken from the count room before official counting, put in suitcases, and moved back to Detroit through messengers. The cash would then be split among partnership members according to their rank. For Jack Tocco, his share of these Vegas operations meant big income, maybe hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars yearly, all completely tax-free and untraceable. This money added to his lawful income and paid for his lifestyle, though he was always careful not to show wealth that couldn't be explained by his legal businesses. But the Vegas link was finally a mixed blessing. The money was great, but the operations needed coordination among many people, moving of big amounts of cash, and ties with casino workers who were possible informants. Every person involved was a possible weak link. As the 1980s went on, federal investigators were building more and more polished ways to prove casino skim operations. They would study casino money patterns, interview workers, track cash movements, and use cooperating witnesses to record the schemes. Jack Tocco, always careful, started to see that the Las Vegas operations were getting too risky. The peak days of wide-open skimming were ending. Keeping involved was asking for trouble, but getting out wasn't simple. Las Vegas interests had been a partnership thing for decades. Other families had expectations about Detroit's role, and the money, while risky to get, was still huge. This pull between the old ways that had made fortunes and the new truth that made those old ways more and more dangerous would shape the challenges Tocco faced throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. To truly get Jack Tocco's success, you have to get the life he built in Grosse Pointe Park. Grosse Pointe is a group of 5 rich suburbs along Lake Street. Clare, east of Detroit proper, its old money, established families, perfect neighborhoods with strict building rules and even stricter social expectations. The communities are mostly white, politically careful, and deeply against anything that might drop property values or disturb the peace. Jack and Tony Tocco fit in perfectly. Their home was big, but not showy, a well-kept property in a good area, but nothing that screamed, "Mob boss lives here." The yard work was perfect. The Christmas decorations were tasteful. The cars in the driveway were nice, but not flashy. Cadillacs and Lincolns, not Ferraris or Lamborghinis. Jack was known as a successful real estate developer and business person. He drove to an office every day, took business calls, met with contractors and clients, and kept a schedule that looked entirely lawful, because in large part it was. His giving to charity was wide and real. He gave to the Catholic Church, regular donations, plus special gifts for building funds and renovation projects. Local hospitals named him as a major donor for certain wings or equipment. Youth sports programs, sponsoring teams, paying for new facilities, community centers, scholarship funds, police and firefighter benevolent associations. That last one is especially worth noting. Jack Tocco gave to police charities. He went to fundraisers with law enforcement officials. He was photographed shaking hands with police chiefs and county sheriffs at charity events. This wasn't crude bribery. It was way more polished than that. It was about creating a web of ties where police officials knew Jack Tocco as a giving community member who backed their causes. When his name came up in investigations, some of those officials might be likely to see him as a lawful business person being unfairly targeted. Rather than as a criminal, his ties spread throughout Detroit society. Politicians, Jack went to fundraisers, made legal campaign donations, and kept friendships with city council members, county commissioners, and state lawmakers. He was careful to give to both Democrats and Republicans. He wasn't trying to control politics, just to make sure he had access and goodwill across the board. Judges, through lawful business dealings, charity work, and social connections. Jack built ties with members of the courts. These weren't crook ties, at least not provably so, but they were valuable anyway, business leaders. As a successful real estate developer, Jack was a member of various business groups, chambers of commerce, and professional groups. He worked with executives from the car industry, banking, and other fields, religious leaders. The Tocco family was strongly Catholic. They went to Mass regularly, gave to the church, and had ties with priests and other clergy who saw them as faithful church members. Sports figures. Detroit is a sports-crazy city, and Jack built ties with Tigers, Lions, Red Wings, and Pistons people. These ties were partly business, chances for investment and development, partly social. Everyone likes hanging out with sports stars, and partly strategic. These ties made him seem normal in the public eye. The genius of this approach was that it was largely real. Jack Tocco wasn't pretending to care about charity or religion or community. He actually did take part in these activities. His donations were real. His going to church was steady. His involvement in community groups was active, not just in name. He had successfully made a double life where both identities were real. At home, he was a devoted husband and dad. His marriage to Toni lasted over 60 years, amazing in any situation, but especially remarkable given the strain that a criminal lifestyle can put on families. By all accounts, he was there in his kids' lives, going to school events, sports games, and family parties. His kids were raised with strict values, respect for authority, ironic given their dad's actual relationship with legal authority, importance of education, devotion to family, and secrecy about private matters. They understood, even if not directly told, that family business was never talked about outside the family. Several of his kids went into professional careers completely outside organized crime. They became successful in lawful fields, keeping the family's upward movement across generations. To the FBI agents assigned to watch him, Jack Tocco was incredibly annoying. They knew he was the boss of the Detroit partnership. They knew he was involved in criminal activities, but proving it was amazingly hard. He rarely used phones for anything sensitive. When he did, he spoke in codes and hints that were hard to understand in court. He met partners in person, often while walking or in spots that were hard to bug. He used go-betweens to shield himself from direct involvement in crimes. His paper trail was mostly clean. His tax returns showed lawful income from documented sources. His businesses were run according to the law. His charity donations were properly reported. His real estate deals were professionally handled through lawyers and title companies. If you looked at Jack Tocco's life on paper, you'd see a successful immigrant family's grandson who had built wealth through intelligence, education, and hard work. The American dream realized the truth below that surface was very different. But the surface was kept up with such care and steadiness that getting through it would take amazing effort. The FBI had been building its case for years. Operation Game Tax, named after the partnership's big gambling operations, involved thousands of hours of watching, hundreds of wiretapped talks, stories from many informants, and coordination among several federal agencies. On March 20th, 1996, federal agents spread out across the Detroit metro area in a planned strike. 17 members and partners of the Detroit partnership were arrested at the same time. The charges said bookmaking operations, loan sharking, extortion, RICO conspiracy, racketeering. Named in the charges were Giacomo Jack Tocco, boss of the Detroit partnership, Anthony Tony Zerilli, underboss, Anthony Joseph Corrado, capo, Vito Billy Jack Giacalone, capo, Paul Big Paulie Corrado, capo, Nove Tocco, capo, Joe Zerilli's grandson, plus 11 other members and partners. The charges were a detailed paper listing decades of criminal activity. It laid out the setup of the Detroit partnership, naming the chain of command and explaining how the group worked. It described specific criminal acts and tried to show a pattern of racketeering that tied to the leadership. For prosecutors, the goal wasn't just to convict individual members for individual crimes. It was to bring down the whole group by proving that it was a criminal business whose very purpose was to commit crimes. The case also brought back a 1970 conviction that Jack Tocco had mostly forgotten about. In 1970, he and several partners had been convicted of horse doping at Hazel Park Raceway. Drugging horses to change how they ran, he had paid a fine and done no jail time. Thinking of it as a cost of doing business, now that 1970 conviction was being used to show a pattern of criminal behavior stretching across decades. The wiretap proof was especially damaging. The FBI had managed to bug various spots where partnership members met. The tapes caught talks about Blackie, Jack Tocco's other nickname, talking about gambling operations. Specs, another Tocco nickname, pointing to his eyeglasses. Okaying loans and collections. Various members talking about the setup of the group. Coded mentions of criminal activities. Defense lawyers would argue that these talks were unclear, that nicknames couldn't be definitely tied, that coded language could mean anything. But taken together, the proof was strong. What maybe surprised investigators was how much criminal activity kept going despite law enforcement pressure. The Detroit partnership in the 1990s wasn't the powerhouse it had been in the 1960s, but it was still making millions in illegal income through usual rackets. Jack Tocco, at age 69, now faced the very real chance of spending his remaining years in federal prison. The federal trial was a long process that stretched across 2 years with many defendants, countless witnesses, thousands of pages of papers, and complex legal arguments about RICO laws, conspiracy law, and organized crime setups. The prosecution plan was to prove 3 main points: that La Cosa Nostra existed as a criminal group, that the Detroit partnership was part of this group, that the defendants were members who committed crimes to help the group's interests. To prove La Cosa Nostra's existence, prosecutors called expert witnesses who spoke about mafia history, setup, and operations. Former FBI agents who had investigated organized crime for decades explained initiation ceremonies, chain of command, and the Code of Omerta. They brought in proof from other trials across the country, showing the national reach of La Cosa Nostra. To prove the Detroit partnership's role, they showed watching proof, wiretap recordings, and cooperating witness stories recording the partnership's setup and activities. To tie the defendants to specific crimes, they showed recordings of talks about bookmaking operations, bank records showing unexplained cash deposits, stories from victims of loan sharking who described the ways of collecting, watching photos showing meetings among defendants, phone records showing suspicious patterns of talking. The defense fought hard at every step, attacking informant believability. Defense lawyers showed cooperating witnesses as career criminals who were lying to shorten their own sentences. They pointed out differences in stories and suggested that informants were telling prosecutors what they wanted to hear. Challenging meanings. When wiretaps were played, defense lawyers gave innocent meanings of talks. Lackey and specs could be anyone. Talks about games could refer to lawful activities. Coded language was unclear, stressing lawful businesses. Jack Tocco's lawyers showed a lot of proof of his lawful business activities. They called witnesses who spoke to his name as a successful developer, charity donor, and community leader. They showed tax returns, business records, and contracts showing legal income streams that could explain his wealth, constitutional challenges. Defense lawyers filed motions questioning the validity of wiretap warrants, arguing that watching broke Fourth Amendment protections. They challenged the RICO law itself as too wide and unclear. For Jack Tocco personally, the defense plan stressed his role as a lawful business person who had been unfairly caught up in an investigation targeting his partners. His 1970 conviction was shown as a young person's mistake from 30 years earlier. His current activities were described as completely legal. The jury talked for weeks, looking over thousands of pages of proof and hundreds of hours of stories. In the end, on various dates in 1997 and 1998, Jack Tocco was found guilty on 2 counts of RICO conspiracy, pattern of racketeering activity, collection of unlawful debts, and Hobbs Act conspiracy. Extortion affecting interstate commerce. Anthony Corrado was also found guilty on many counts. Paul Corrado was found guilty on related charges. Nove Tocco, Joe Zerilli's grandson, was found guilty on several counts. Vito Billy Jack Giacalone pleaded guilty to avoid trial. Other defendants either pleaded guilty or were found not guilty on some charges or got mixed decisions. For Jack Tocco, conviction on RICO charges was especially serious. RICO carried higher penalties and importantly let prosecutors seek taking of assets they could prove came from or were used in criminal activity. The government filed taking proceedings seeking $54 million in things from Tocco. Arguing that this amount came from his criminal activities, they wanted to take real estate, bank accounts, and other property. The defense fought this hard, arguing that prosecutors couldn't prove which things came from legal activities versus illegal activities. Given Tocco's big lawful business interests, this was a strong argument. The district court finally ruled that while criminal activity had happened, the government hadn't given enough proof to prove that specific things were directly from those crimes. The $54 million taking was mostly denied, though some things were taken. This was a partial win for Tocco. He had been convicted, but he wouldn't lose his fortune. November 13, 1998. Federal Courthouse, Detroit, Michigan. The sentencing hearing for Jack Tocco was unlike most mob sentencing events. Usually, such hearings were fighting events where prosecutors demanded maximum sentences and defendants had little support. Jack Tocco's hearing looked like a testimonial dinner. The courtroom was packed with character witnesses, including Sparky Anderson, the famous manager of the Detroit Tigers, one of the most loved sports figures in Michigan history, came to speak for Tocco. He described Jack as a friend. a generous man who had backed baseball in Detroit, and someone he had always known to be honorable. Warren Mayor Ronald Bonkowski, a sitting mayor, spoke about Tocco's gifts to the community, and his name as a solid citizen, Frank Stalla, a well-known political fundraiser who had worked with Tocco on various campaigns, spoke about his community involvement. Gary Vito, head guy for the Detroit Tigers, who had business dealings with Tocco and thought of him as a friend and work contact. Patrick Petz, Grosse Pointe City Councilman, who spoke to Tocco's part in the Grosse Pointe community also. Letters were sent in from restaurant owners who knew Tocco as a regular customer and friend. Retired judges who had known him socially, doctors who had treated his family, lawyers who had worked with him on lawful business deals, Catholic priests who spoke about his religious devotion and charity giving. This flood of support was amazing. These weren't casual friends or paid character witnesses. They were well-known citizens truly speaking about Jack Tocco's character as they had known it. The prosecution gave their case for a big prison sentence. They argued that Tocco had been the boss of a criminal group for nearly 20 years. His activities had hurt victims through extortion and illegal gambling. His continued leadership had kept organized crime going in Detroit. Only a big sentence would do justice and stop others. But the huge amount of support for Tocco clearly affected the proceedings. Judge John Corbett O'Meara, who ran the case, seemed truly torn. Here was a man convicted of serious crimes. Yet the proof before the court suggested someone who had also led a life of community service and family devotion. In his first sentencing choice, Judge O'Meara sentenced Tocco to 1 year or less in a halfway house, a place where prisoners could leave during the day to work and handle business. Coming back only at night to sleep, it was the lightest possible sentence given the conviction. The prosecution was furious. They filed an immediate appeal, arguing that such a gentle sentence made a joke of the serious crimes Tocco had been convicted of doing. The appeal process meant weeks of extra legal fighting. Prosecutors argued that the sentence was unreasonably gentle given the nature of the charges. Defense lawyers argued that Judge O'Meara had rightly used judicial choice in thinking about Tocco's age, 72, his health problems, his lack of violent crime history, and the huge character proof. On December 23, 1998, Judge O'Meara sentenced Tocco again. The new sentence: 1 year at the Federal Medical Place in Rochester, Minnesota, a minimum security federal prison that focused on treating prisoners with health problems. It was still a remarkably light sentence for a convicted mob boss. Many watchers believe that the mountain of character proof, along with Tocco's age and lack of past major prison time, convinced the judge that a long sentence wasn't needed. Jack Tocco reported to Rochester in early 1999. The place was sometimes called Club Fed because of its fairly comfortable conditions. Compared to higher security prisons, prisoners had access to medical care, learning programs, and fun facilities. Security was low because prisoners were not violent offenders, seen as low flight risks. Tocco served about 11 months before being released in late 1999 or early 2000. With good time credits, federal prisoners can shorten their sentences by up to 15%, which likely explains his release before the full year was done. During his time inside, he got regular visits from family. He reportedly kept his dignity in bearing, never complaining about his situation, and keeping the code of silence about his group's activities. When he got out, he went back to Grosse Pointe Park, to his wife Toni, to his kids and grandkids, and remarkably to his spot as boss of the Detroit Partnership. The Operation Game tax prosecutions had hit the Detroit Partnership hard, but the group survived. Unlike some crime families that basically broke up after major prosecutions, Detroit kept its setup and operations. However, splits were showing. Tony Zerilli got a longer sentence than Tocco, about 5 years in federal prison. While he was away, his connection with his cousin Jack got worse. There were fights about money, about who should be running things during his time inside, about claim slights and disrespect. When Zerilli was released in the early 2000s, he expected to go back to his spot as underboss. Instead, according to some accounts, he was demoted or pushed aside by younger members who had taken on more duty during his time away. This created bad feelings that would eventually have dramatic results. Hazel Park Raceway had to be sold. The track had been under Tocco Zerilli control since 1949, making it one of the longest-held things in American Mafia history. But the taking proceedings and the watching that came with the prosecutions made keeping ownership impossible. The track was sold to new owners in the late 1990s, ending 5 decades of partnership control. For Jack Tocco, this was more than a money loss. It was the end of an age. Nove Tocco made the most shocking choice of all. Joe Zerilli's grandson, a convicted felon and made member of the Detroit Partnership, became an FBI informant in 2000. This was unheard of in Detroit mob history. Despite countless prosecutions over the decades, the Zerilli and Tocco families had stayed solid. The code of omerta had held. No family member had ever spoken against the group. Nove Tocco broke that pattern. He didn't speak at trial. His cooperation came after his conviction, but he gave information to the FBI about partnership operations, about his grandpa's time, about the setup of the group. He even spoke at Jack Tocco's sentencing hearing, though the details of his speaking stay partly secret. The reasons for his cooperation are unclear. Some suggest he was threatened with a long sentence and chose the easiest path. Others claim he had personal grudges against other family members. Still others believe he truly wanted out of the life and saw cooperation as his way out. Whatever his reasons, his betrayal was total. He went into the witness protection program and was moved with a new identity, cutting all ties with Detroit and the partnership. For Jack Tocco and the remaining loyal members, this was a bitter betrayal, but it was also a sign of changing times. The old code was breaking down. The younger generation didn't have the same commitment to omerta that had marked their dads and grandpas. Despite these setbacks, Jack Tocco stayed in control. He was in his mid-70s by the early 2000s, but he kept running the partnership's remaining operations. The group was smaller, less powerful, and under constant FBI watching. But it still existed. Gambling operations kept going. Though on a smaller scale, loan sharking still made income. Labor union ties still gave chances for profit, and the lawful businesses kept doing well. Jack Tocco's plan stayed the same. Keep a low profile, do business carefully, and avoid the mistakes that had brought down other bosses. No flashy shows of wealth, no public fights, no unnecessary violence, just quiet, controlled, smart management of what was left of the Detroit Partnership's criminal empire. In January 2013, Anthony Tony Zerilli, now in his mid-80s and fighting cancer, made a choice that stunned both the FBI and the remaining members of the Detroit Partnership. He contacted federal authorities with information about Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, 37 years after Hoffa vanished. One of the men believed to have been in on the murder was now claiming he knew where the body was buried. According to Zerilli's statements to the FBI, informants had told him that Jimmy Hoffa had been driven to Jack Tocco's property in Oakland Township after being picked up from the Mashu's Red Fox restaurant. He was killed on the property, beaten to death with a shovel. His body was buried in what was then an open field on the Tocco property. The burial spot was under a barn or outbuilding that was built shortly after Hoffa's death. Zerilli claimed he hadn't been directly in on the murder, but had learned these details from other partnership members over the years. He said he had kept quiet for decades out of loyalty to the group and fear of prosecution. But now facing his own death, and having been pushed aside by his cousin Jack, he wanted the truth to come out. The FBI took his claim seriously. Zerilli wasn't a random tipster. He had been the underboss of the Detroit partnership and was in a spot to know what had happened. His story had specific details and matched other information the FBI had gathered over the years. In June 2013, a huge digging operation was started at Jack Tocco's former Oakland Township property. Now owned by others, the FBI brought in ground-penetrating radar machines, cadaver dogs, archaeologists, heavy digging machines, crime scene experts. News media from around the world came to the site. The Hoffa case had stayed in the public mind for decades, and the chance of finally solving the puzzle created huge interest. For weeks, the FBI dug. They took away tons of dirt. They dug under buildings. They searched with fancy machines. They could detect breakdown chemicals or unusual dirt disturbances. They found nothing, no remains, no proof of burial, no crime scene material suggesting a body had ever been there. The dig was a total failure, and Tony Zerilli's believability was wrecked. Either he had been given wrong information, or he had made up the story for his own reasons, or the body had been moved at some point after first burial. For Jack Tocco, watching from his Grosse Pointe Park home, the show must have been both scary and proving he was right. Scary because if remains had been found, he would have been the main suspect in one of the most famous murders in American history. Proving he was right because the failed search showed that after 38 years, despite Tony Zerilli's betrayal, despite decades of FBI investigation, despite ground-penetrating radar and modern crime science, they still had nothing on him. The connection between Jack Tocco and Tony Zerilli, already strained after the Operation Gain Tax prosecutions, was now completely cut. These men who had grown up together, who had shared ownership of Hazel Park Raceway, who had been boss and underboss of the partnership, were now bitter enemies. Zerilli would die in March 2015 at the age of 87, less than a year after his cousin Jack. His last years were marked by his failed attempt to solve the Hoffa case and by his complete split from the group he had once helped lead. Whether he actually knew where Hoffa was buried, or whether his claims were driven by hate toward his cousin stays unknown. The truth, if there was truth in his statements, died with him after his release from federal prison around 2000. Jack Tocco lived what looked like a quiet retirement. He was in his mid-70s, had done his time, and by all outside signs was just a successful retired business person enjoying his later years. But according to FBI information, he stayed the boss of the Detroit partnership until his death in 2014. This was amazing. Jack Tocco served as boss for about 35 years. From 1979 to 2014, this made him the longest-running mob boss in American history, beating famous figures who had led their groups for decades. For comparison, Carlo Gambino ran the Gambino family for 19 years. Vito Genovese led for about 15 years before prison. Joseph Bonanno claimed leadership for 30 years, but spent much of that time in internal fight or retired. Jack Tocco's 35-year rule was unmatched, and even more remarkably, he did it despite a major RICO conviction, the leaving of family members to the FBI, his cousin's public betrayal, constant FBI watching, the breakdown of traditional organized crime across America. During his last 10 years, Tocco was far less active in day-to-day operations. The partnership had been destroyed by prosecutions, deaths, and the simple passing of time. The group that once had 100 made members now probably had fewer than 20. The big gambling empire had shrunk. The labor union sway had weakened. The Las Vegas operations were completely gone. But the group still existed, still made income, and still kept some shape of the setup that had marked it for over 70 years. Jack Tocco, even in his 80s, still commanded respect. When choices needed to be made, when fights came up, when new members were suggested for induction, his okay was needed. The old boss, as he was sometimes called, stayed the final authority. His daily life was quiet and home-based. He spent time with his wife Toni, now nearing 60 years of marriage. He saw his kids and his growing number of grandkids. He went to Mass regularly. He kept up his home and property. To neighbors and casual friends, he was just an older man enjoying retirement. Only a small circle knew the truth that this quiet grandpa figure sitting in his Grosse Pointe Park home was the longest-running mafia boss in American history. The FBI kept watching him until the end. Agents took pictures of him sometimes, tracked his visitors, and kept information files on his activities. But prosecuting him again seemed unlikely. He had already been convicted once. He was in his 80s with various health problems, and proving current. Criminal activity was amazingly hard given his careful operational security. The Bureau likely took the view that they would just wait him out. Tocco was old. He wouldn't live forever when he died. The Detroit partnership would likely die with him or become so small as to be unimportant. During these last years, one question must have haunted investigators, and maybe Tocco himself. Did he know where Jimmy Hoffa was buried? After Tony Zerilli's failed dig, after decades of searches and tips and ideas, the puzzle stayed unsolved. If Jack Tocco had been in on Hoffa's murder, and most experts believe he had given the final, okay, did he know what had happened to the body? He never said. Not to investigators, not to partners, not even apparently to family members. If he knew, the secret stayed locked behind the code of omerta that had ruled his whole life. July 14th, 2014, Grosse Pointe Park, Michigan. Giacomo Blackjack Tocco died of natural causes at the age of 87 in his home with his wife, Toni, and family members at his bedside. He had lived longer than almost any major mafia figure in American history, had run his group for 35 years, and had spent only 11 months behind bars. The death certificate listed various health problems tied to advanced age. There was no drama, no violence, no deathbed confession. He just passed away peacefully, surrounded by those he loved in the home he had lived in for decades. The death notices published in Detroit newspapers described him as a successful businessperson and devoted family man. They mentioned his real estate development career, his charity work, and his surviving 8 kids, 17 grandkids, and 2 great-grandkids. There was no mention of the Detroit partnership or organized crime. The funeral plans were handled by Bagnasco and Calcaterra Funeral Home in Sterling Heights, a well-known place that served many well-known Italian-American families in the Detroit area. The visitation was well attended. Friends, family, business partners, and community members came to pay their respects. The FBI took pictures of those there, as they always did at mob funerals. They spotted various known organized crime figures among the mourners, though by 2014, most of the old guard was gone. The partnership that came to Jack Tocco's funeral was a shadow of what it had been. A funeral mass was held at a Catholic church in the Detroit area. The service was traditional, showing Tocco's lifelong Catholic faith. The priest who led the mass spoke about Jack's devotion to family, his charity works, and his faith, themes that were truly true. Even if the full story of his life had parts the priest either didn't know or chose not to mention. Jack Tocco was buried in a Detroit area cemetery, his grave marked with a simple but dignified headstone bearing his name and dates. There were no mob symbols, no sign that this was the last resting spot of one of the most successful mafia bosses in American history. For the FBI, his death marked a major moment. The Detroit Partnership, which had been a powerful force in organized crime for over 80 years, was now basically without a leader. While some members stayed and would try to keep operations going, the group would never again be what it had been. For the Tocco family, his death was the loss of a husband, dad, grandpa, and great-grandpa who had always been there in their lives, who had provided for them, who had taught them values of family loyalty and secrecy. For historians and true crime fans, his death meant the loss of someone who could have answered so many questions. What really happened to Jimmy Hoffa? What were the details of the partnership's operations during its peak age? What secrets about Detroit's underworld had he known? All of those answers died with him as of 2025, nearly 50 years after Jimmy Hoffa walked into the parking lot of the Mashu's Red Fox restaurant and vanished. His fate stays officially unsolved. No body has ever been found. No one has ever been charged with his murder. The case stays open in the FBI's books. But among law enforcement experts, organized crime historians, and those who have studied the case for decades, there is pretty much agreement about what happened. The choice, the Detroit Partnership, in consultation with other crime families who had stakes in the Teamsters pension fund, decided that Hoffa had to be removed. His campaign to get back the Teamsters presidency threatened the mob's control over the union and its pension fund. His explosive personality and wide knowledge of mob activities made him a possible witness if he was ever pressured by prosecutors. The choice was made at the highest levels, and Jack Tocco, as a rising leader in the partnership, almost certainly gave his approval. The lure. Hoffa was told that Anthony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano wanted to meet with him to talk about fixing their differences. Hoffa, thinking he could talk his way back into power, agreed to the meeting. The spot, a public restaurant in broad daylight, seemed safe enough. The taking, Hoffa waited at the restaurant. But the meeting was never real. He was picked up probably by someone he knew and trusted, possibly Chucky O'Brien, his foster son, or another close partner. He got into a car, thinking he was being driven to a different spot for the meeting. The murder, Hoffa was driven to a picked-out spot, maybe a house, maybe a business place controlled by the partnership. He was killed quickly, probably with a gun or through blunt force trauma. The murder was done by trusted partnership members, possibly including the Giacalone brothers. The disposal. This is where sureness ends and the ideas multiply. The body had to be gotten rid of so completely that it could never be found. Many ideas exist. The cremation idea stays one of the most believable. Detroit had mob-connected businesses with industrial furnaces or incinerators, able to fully destroy human remains. A funeral home, a waste place, or an industrial plant could have been used. Within hours of the murder, Hoffa's body could have been reduced to ash and scattered. The dump idea suggests the body was put in a container, maybe a 55-gallon drum filled with concrete, and buried in a dump, the central sanitation place in Hamtramck, which had mob ties, has been mentioned many times. A New Jersey dump near Giants Stadium has also been investigated. The problem with dumps is that they have millions of tons of trash, making targeted searches almost impossible. The multiple disposal idea suggests the body was cut up and gotten rid of through various methods. Some parts burned, others put in different spots, making sure that even if one part was found, it couldn't be identified or tied to the crime. The property burial idea was Tony Zerilli's claim about Jack Tocco's Oakland Township property. While the FBI dig found nothing, it's possible the body was first buried there and later moved when development of the property made discovery more likely. The water disposal idea, one lasting Detroit street rumor, claims Hoffa ended up as seafood in the Great Lakes. It suggests the body was dumped in the Detroit River or one of the Great Lakes. The Detroit River connects to Lake St. Clair and finally to Lake Huron. Millions of square miles of water where a body could vanish forever. The concrete idea suggests Hoffa was buried in concrete at a building site, maybe a stadium, a building foundation, or infrastructure project. This idea has led to investigations of many building projects done in 1975, but none have given proof. The truth is that we may never know. Every main figure in the case is now dead. Jack Tocco, Tony Giacalone, Vito Giacalone, Chucky O'Brien, Anthony Provenzano, and everyone else who might have had direct knowledge have taken their secrets to the grave. The FBI has spent countless millions investigating the case. They've dug up properties, talked to thousands of witnesses, studied crime scene proof, and followed every lead. In 2019, they did cadaver dog searches at a home in Michigan. In 2021, they investigated another property. In 2023, new ideas led to more searches. All have come up empty. For the Hoffa family, especially his kids, who have spent their whole adult lives wondering what happened to their dad. The lack of closure has been painful. James P. Hoffa, Jimmy's son, has publicly said that he believes the mob killed his father and that proving it has been impossible because of the silence plot. Jack Tocco, if he was in on it, set up the perfect crime. A murder witnessed by no one who would talk. A body gotten rid of so completely that 50 years of searching has shown nothing. A plot so controlled that despite many informants and cooperating witnesses, no solid proof has ever come out. It was the final expression of omerta, the code of silence that is La Cosa Nostra at its core. What made Jack Tocco different from other mob bosses? Why did he succeed where so many others failed? Getting this requires looking at what set his approach apart. Intelligence over violence. Unlike bosses who ruled through fear and intimidation, Tocco understood that violence was a last-choice tool. Every murder created possible informants, set off investigations, and made publicity. Tocco used violence rarely and smartly only when absolutely needed. Problems were fixed through talks, money arrangements, and careful handling of relationships. Business sense over showing off. Tocco had a true gift for business. His real estate developments were actually profitable. His lawful companies were well run. He understood finance, accounting, and investment in ways that most mobsters didn't. This let him make big legal income that both gave cover for illegal activities and made sure he would be wealthy, even if his criminal businesses were shut down. Invisibility over flash. While John Gotti was wearing $1,000 suits and giving speeches on courthouse steps, Jack Tocco was wearing off-the-rack clothing and avoiding cameras. While other bosses drove fancy cars and lived in mansions that screamed mob boss, Tocco drove normal cars and lived in a nice but average home. His wealth was real but not showily displayed. Long-term plan over short-term gains. Tocco thought in decades, not in weeks. He made choices based on long-term survival rather than quick profit. He understood that building relationships, keeping control, and avoiding unnecessary risks would pay off over time. Community mixing over separation. Many mob bosses lived in closed Italian-American communities, surrounded only by other criminals and those who feared them. Tocco purposely mixed himself into wider society, building ties with people across Detroit, giving to mainstream groups, and making a public image that had nothing to do with organized crime. Comparisons to other mob bosses are telling. John Gotti, boss of the Gambino family, was Tocco's opposite in almost every way. Gotti loved publicity, dressed flashy, held court at the Ravenite social club where everyone could see him, and basically dared law enforcement to catch him. He was eventually convicted and died in prison. His fame destroyed him. Al Capone, the model mob boss, ruled through violence and intimidation. He lived richly, spent wildly, and became so famous that he couldn't work effectively. He was convicted of tax evasion because prosecutors couldn't prove his violent crimes and spent his last years in prison and then in worsening health. His fame was his undoing. Sammy the Bull Gravano became the highest-ranking mobster ever to turn government witness. Betraying John Gotti and others, he broke omerta completely, something Tocco would never do, even under pressure, even when convicted. Even when facing long prison time, Tocco never worked with the government. Meyer Lansky, the so-called mob's accountant, is maybe Tocco's closest match. Lansky was smart, business-minded, and mostly avoided serious prison time throughout his career. He died a fairly free man at age 80. Like Tocco, he understood that real power didn't need public displays. Like Tocco, he built lawful businesses next to criminal ones. And like Tocco, he kept control and secrecy that frustrated law enforcement for decades. The lawful businesses that Tocco built served many purposes. Cash flow. They made actual profits that could be spent, invested, and enjoyed without raising tax questions, money cleaning. They gave ways to turn illegal cash into legal bank deposits through padded bills. Fake costs and legal-looking deals, respectability, successful. Lawful businesses created ties with bankers, accountants, lawyers, and other professionals who saw Tocco as a client, not a criminal. Cover. When investigators looked at Tocco's finances, they saw real estate deals, building contracts, rental income, all explainable and documentable. Finding the illegal money hidden among legal deals was amazingly hard. Character proof. When Tocco was finally prosecuted, his lawyers could point to decades of successful lawful business as proof that he was mostly a business person, not a career criminal. His community involvement served similar planned purposes, but it also seems to have been real in many ways. His charity donations weren't just for show. He actually gave big amounts to causes he believed in. His church attendance wasn't just cover. He seems to have been truly religious, going to Mass regularly, even when no one was watching. This complexity, the ability to be at the same time a devoted Catholic and a mob boss, a community rock and a criminal, a loving family man and someone who ordered murders, is what makes Jack Tocco such an interesting figure. He wasn't pretending to be one thing while secretly being another. He actually was both things at once. The identities were mixed, not separate. He could give a generous donation to a kid's hospital in the morning and okay a beating for a late payer in the afternoon. Seeing no clash between these actions, this mental splitting, the ability to truly hold opposite identities without mental upset, is maybe the most amazing part of Tocco's personality. When Jack Tocco died in July 2014, the Detroit partnership didn't die with him, but it was deeply lessened. According to FBI information, Jackie the Kid Giacalone, son of Vito Billy Giacalone and nephew of the late Tony Jack Giacalone, came out as the reputed acting boss or street boss of the group. He was born in 1950, making him 64 years old when Tocco died, young by mob boss standards. But the group he took over was nothing like what his dad and uncle had known in their peak. By 2014, the Detroit partnership probably had fewer than 15 made members left. Compare this to the guest 100 made members during the group's peak in the 1960s, and the drop is clear. What was left for the post-Tocco partnership? Labor union leftovers, some say over certain local unions, especially in building and entertainment industries, illegal gambling, small-scale operations that kept going despite legalization, serving customers who liked the old ways or wanted to bet on credit, loan sharking, high-interest loans to desperate people, though on a much smaller scale, extortion, protection rackets, and tribute payments from some businesses, though this was increasingly risky given watching tech and witness cooperation, lawful businesses, various legal ones controlled by members making actual income or possibly helping money cleaning. The group's setup had gotten simpler. The detailed chain of command of boss, underboss, consigliere, many capos, and dozens of soldiers had been cut to a small group of older men who kept ties and coordinated activities more casually than in the past. The FBI kept watching the group, but with less effort than during its peak. The Bureau's resources were increasingly focused on terrorism, computer crime, and other threats. A smaller mafia family in Detroit was still worth watching, but it wasn't a top need. The Detroit partnership in the post-Tocco time looked like similar groups across America. The mafia was in decline everywhere. The Bonanno family in New York, once one of the 5 families, had been so destroyed that questions came up about its continued life as a working group. The Philadelphia family had been cut to maybe a dozen active members. The New England family, once powerful, was nearly gone. Even the Gambino family, biggest of the New York families, was much weaker than its 1980s peak. Several things added to this national drop. RICO prosecutions. The federal government's aggressive use of RICO laws had led to mass convictions of mob leadership across many families. Informant culture, the Code of Omerta had mostly broken. Faced with long prison sentences, many mobsters chose working with the government. Once a few flipped, others followed, making a chain of informing, changing population patterns. The Italian-American community had mixed into mainstream American society. Second, third, and fourth-generation Italian-Americans had legal chances their grandparents didn't have. Joining the mafia was no longer an appealing path for ambitious young men. Money changes. The industries the mafia had traditionally controlled, manufacturing, docks, building, trash handling, had changed a lot. World trade, automation, and rule changes had cut chances for mob entry. Competing criminal groups, Mexican cartels controlled drug dealing. Russian organized crime had come out as a major force. Asian criminal groups controlled various rackets. Street gangs like MS-13 were more violent and less held back by traditional rules. The mafia's almost total control of organized crime in America had ended. Watching tech, modern watching abilities, GPS tracking, advanced wiretapping, face recognition, electronic money watching made traditional mob operations far more risky than in the past. The Detroit partnership that continues to exist today is a leftover of what it once was. A small group of mostly older men keeping traditions and relationships that may not last another generation. What can we learn from Jack Tocco's amazing career? His success measured by long life and ability to avoid serious prison time, gives lessons that go past organized crime. Discretion is power. The quieter you are about your abilities and activities, the more effectively you can work. Tocco understood that public displays of power, whether through violence, wealth, or status, invited unwanted attention. True power doesn't need to announce itself. Legitimacy gives cover. The more lawful parts of your operation, the harder it is for enemies, whether law enforcement or competitors, to target you. Tocco's lawful businesses weren't just covers. They were real businesses that made real income and real relationships. Relationships are assets. Tocco's web of ties throughout Detroit society with politicians, business leaders, religious figures, and community groups gave both information and protection. These ties made it harder to prosecute him and easier to work. Change or die. Tocco changed with the times. From the peak age of the 1960s through the RICO age of the 1980s and 90s to the smaller group of the 2000s. Leaders who couldn't change were swept away. Tocco changed his approach while keeping core principles. Never talk, despite a major conviction, despite family betrayals, despite intense pressure. Tocco never worked with law enforcement. His commitment to omerta was total. This loyalty to principle, even when it cost him personally, earned him respect and made prosecution harder. These lessons apply far past organized crime. Any leader working in a risky competitive setting can learn from Tocco's approach. Keep legitimacy, build ties, avoid unnecessary fights. Think long-term, change, and above all, be quiet about abilities and plans. Despite decades of investigation, thousands of pages of FBI files, many trials, and many informants, many questions about Jack Tocco's life and career stay unanswered. Did he personally order Hoffa's death? While most experts believe the Detroit Partnership was responsible and that Tocco, as a high-ranking member in 1975, would have been in on such a major choice, there's no clear proof. Tocco never admitted it. No informant directly placed him in the planning. His exact part stays guessing. Where is Hoffa's body? If Tocco knew, and he almost certainly did if he was in on the murder plot, he took that secret to his grave. Despite Tony Zerilli's claims and the FBI dig, the body has never been found. Did Tocco personally know the disposal method and spot? Or was that information kept separate even within the plot? What secrets about Detroit's underworld died with him? Tocco lived through 8 decades of Detroit organized crime history. He knew about Prohibition age, bootlegging from his dad's stories. He lived through the peak age of the 1960s. He knew about the partnership's ties with other families, about deals made and broken, about crimes solved and unsolved. All of that knowledge disappeared when he died. Was his community involvement real or just planned? This might be the most interesting mental question. Did Tocco actually care about the Catholic Church, kids' charities, and community causes he backed? Or was it all calculated image handling? The proof suggests it was truly both, that he truly believed in some of these causes, while also seeing their planned value. How did he keep his marriage? 60-plus years of marriage to Tony is amazing in any situation, but especially given the pressures of his lifestyle. How much did she know? How did they get through his criminal career while keeping a stable family? What was their actual relationship like behind closed doors? What did his kids know? Did Tocco's 8 kids grow up getting what their father really was? Or were they truly kept in the dark? Some family members have given occasional interviews over the years, but they've given little insight into their father's criminal activities. What was his connection with other mob families? As boss of Detroit, Tocco would have had ties with leaders of other families across the country. What were these ties like? Was he respected, feared, dismissed as a leftover? How did he get through the politics of a national mafia group? These questions will likely never be answered. The FBI has closed many of its files on dead mobsters. But even those files that stay secret probably don't have answers to the most interesting questions. Some things were never written down. Some talks were never recorded. Some secrets were kept even from closest partners. Jack Tocco successfully guarded his secrets throughout his life. His death made sure those secrets would stay guarded forever. In the end, Jack Tocco's story is the story of the American Mafia itself. Its rise, its peak age, its change to changing times, and its unavoidable drop. He was born into Mafia royalty at the perfect moment when organized crime was changing from messy ethnic gangs into smart criminal businesses. He grew up during the peak age when the Mafia's power in America was at its highest. He took leadership just as that power was starting to drop, and he died as the group was fading into history. That he survived and did well for so long. 35 years as boss, 87 years of life, only 11 months behind bars, shows an amazing achievement in a field where most people end up dead or in prison. The Mafia drew many smart men over its history in America, but most let ego, greed, or impulse destroy them. Tocco's success lay in his ability to push down those destructive urges, to think clearly even under pressure, to play the long game when others looked for quick satisfaction. He proved that in organized crime, as in lawful business and life, intelligence beats violence, patience beats aggression, and secrecy beats showing off. He was in many ways the anti-Godfather, not the dramatic, larger-than-life figure of Mario Puzo's imagination, but something more everyday and more effective. A business person who happened to work outside the law, a family man who ordered murders, a community rock who controlled a criminal empire. The irony is that his very success in staying hidden means most people have never heard of him. John Gotti is a household name. Jack Tocco is unknown outside organized crime circles. But Gotti died in prison at 61, while Tocco died at home at 87. History will remember John Gotti, but if Jack Tocco were here to comment, he'd probably prefer it that way. Being forgotten was always part of the plan. The Detroit partnership continues in some smaller form, but it will never again be what it was under the Zerilli Tocco dynasty. The world has changed too much. The chances that existed in the 20th century don't exist in the 21st. And the tradition that men like Jack Tocco showed, the old school omerta, the chain of command, the detailed rules and steps, these traditions are dying with the men who live them. Jack Tocco was the last of his kind, the last boss to rule for decades, the last to keep full operational security in the modern watching age, the last to show the traditional mafia values while successfully changing to current challenges. He was quite literally the last godfather of the old school. And when he died in July 2014, peacefully in his bed in Grosse Pointe Park, and age died with him, the mafia continues. But the mafia he knew, controlled, bound by tradition and omerta, that mafia is basically gone. Maybe that's why the Hoffa puzzle lasts. It stands for something that's been lost. The ability of organized crime to successfully do complex plots, to keep control among many people, to keep secrets for decades despite huge law enforcement pressure. Modern criminals tell on each other for shorter sentences. Modern mob bosses get recorded on wiretaps showing off about their deeds. Modern crime families are full of informants who work with the government at the first sign of trouble. The plot that vanished Jimmy Hoffa needed amazing control. Many people, complex planning, perfect doing, and 50 years of silence despite huge pressure to talk. That level of coordination and loyalty seems impossible today. Jack Tocco, if he was in on it, helped plan that perfect crime. And whether or not he actually did, his life stood for the same rules: control, loyalty, patience, and above all, silence. In an age of social media, reality TV, and endless self-promotion, there's something almost admirable about a man who lived 87 years, held huge power, gathered big wealth, and did it all while staying almost unseen by the public. He built an empire in the shadows. He ruled without fame. He died without fanfare. And his secrets died with him. That maybe is the greatest achievement of all, to have lived such an amazing life that almost nobody knows about. So there you have it, the full honest story of Jack Tocco. If this story kept you glued, if you stayed until the end, do me a favor, hit that like button. It tells me you want more deep dive gangster stories like this. Subscribe and turn on that notice bell, because I've got a whole library of untold mob stories coming your way. From the 5 families of New York to the Kansas City mob, from the Philadelphia Underworld to the Detroit Partnership, we're going deep into the shadows of American organized crime. Thanks for listening to the very end. Stay safe out there, and remember, in the world of organized crime, loyalty is rare, betrayal is common, and violence is always just one wrong move away. Until next time, sleep tight if you can,